Eloise Garner has spent her entire life proving that she belongs in spaces that weren't built for her. A powerful, self-made woman, she has fought through every whisper, every judgmental stare, every moment where someone decided, without knowing a thing about her, that she didn't deserve her success. As a black woman, as someone who has never fit society's narrow expectations, she has faced it all. But sometimes, the cruelty isn't whispered. Sometimes it's loud. It's public. It's ruthless. On what should have been a simple first-class flight, Eloise finds herself face-to-face with Caldwell Draper, a man who embodies unchecked privilege and arrogance. He doesn't just look down on her, he makes sure she knows it. The weight of his words, the sharpness of his mockery, the way he wields his power to humiliate her. It's more than just an insult. It's a message that no matter how hard she's worked, men like him will always believe she doesn't belong. But what happens when the tables turn? Because what Caldwell Draper doesn't know, what he never even considered, is that the woman he just tried to destroy is someone he should have never crossed. And before this flight lands, he will pay the price. Want to see what happens next? Hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment when justice is served. What do you think Caldwell's fate should be? Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Caldwell Draper stepped onto the first-class cabin like he owned it, which in many ways he believed he did. A man of power, wealth, and an unshakable sense of superiority. He had spent years cultivating the belief that the world existed in a hierarchy, one in which he sat comfortably at the very top. His finely tailored suit clung to his athletic frame as he strode forward, his polished shoes clicking against the pristine flooring. His gaze swept the cabin with calculated precision, assessing who belonged and who, in his mind, did not. Then he saw her. Seated, or rather, struggling to settle into her seat, was a woman who, to Caldwell, embodied everything he despised. Eloise Garner, a heavy-set black woman in her late 50s, was wedged into her first-class seat, her broad hips overflowing onto the armrests, her thick legs pressing uncomfortably against the narrow confines of a luxurious space. She was dressed in a modest navy blue pantsuit that stretched over her full figure, her hands gripping the seatbelt that barely reached around her waist. Her face, warm with soft features and framed by graying curls, was etched with quiet determination as she attempted to secure herself into the chair. Caldwell came to an abrupt stop, his expression contorting into one of visible disgust. He sneered, glancing around the cabin as if expecting someone to share in his incredulity. Was this a joke? First class was meant to exude refinement, exclusivity, the pinnacle of wealth and privilege. Yet, somehow, this woman had made her way into his sanctuary of luxury. His nostrils flared as he turned to the nearest flight attendant, a young woman with meticulously tied blonde hair and a neatly pressed uniform. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I wasn't aware first-class seating had been expanded. Shouldn't there be weight restrictions?" The flight attendant blinked, clearly taken aback. A few passengers turned their heads, sensing the tension, but no one intervened. They never did. Caldwell's reputation preceded him. CEO of one of the largest financial firms in the country, a man whose influence reached into every industry, including aviation. Eloise froze, her fingers tightening around the seatbelt. Her cheeks flushed, and for a brief moment she debated responding, but experience had taught her that men like Caldwell weren't interested in conversation. They enjoyed belittling others. It gave them a twisted sense of power. She exhaled slowly and kept her eyes fixed on her seatbelt, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Caldwell, however, wasn't done. He leaned slightly toward the flight attendant and added in an exaggerated whisper, "I mean, this is a safety hazard, isn't it? If there's turbulence, what's stopping her from crushing the person next to her?" A quiet murmur rippled through the cabin. The flight attendant, visibly uncomfortable, cleared her throat. "Sir, all passengers in first class have purchased their seats accordingly. Ms. Garner has every right to be here." Caldwell let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "Every right? I highly doubt that. Look at her, she can barely fit. This is first class, not livestock transport." Eloise felt the sting of his words deep in her chest. She swallowed the lump in her throat, her hands shaking as she tried once more to buckle her seatbelt. The metal clasp refused to meet. She bit the inside of her cheek. Not now. Not in front of him. Caldwell watched with amusement, his smirk widening. Need some help, sweetheart? He taunted. Maybe we should call maintenance and see if they've got an industrial-strength seatbelt lying around. The laughter was quieter this time, but it was there. Small chuckles from those too spineless to stand up to him. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, pretending not to hear. A man sitting a few rows ahead, a middle-aged businessman with silver hair, cleared his throat as if debating whether to speak, but then thought better of it. Caldwell Draper wasn't someone people confronted. Eloise took a deep breath and pressed the flight attendant button. A chime rang out, and another crew member, a senior flight attendant with a composed expression, approached. "Ma'am, is there anything I can assist you with?" Before Eloise could respond, Caldwell cut in. "Yes, actually. You can find her a seat in economy, where she'll be more comfortable. And while you're at it, maybe stop by the catering staff and cancel whatever extra meals she's ordered. I assume that's why the plane's taking longer to taxi." The words sliced through her. Eloise's lips trembled, but she pressed them together, willing herself not to break. Not here. Not in front of him. The senior flight attendant's jaw tightened. "Sir, I must insist that you lower your voice and treat your fellow passengers with respect." Caldwell let out another condescending chuckle and raised his hands in mock surrender. All right. I was just offering a solution. But if she ends up needing 2 oxygen masks when we take off, don't say I didn't warn you." Eloise closed her eyes, willing the burning behind them to subside. The plane hadn't even taken off, and already she felt suffocated. Caldwell Draper leaned back into his seat with an exaggerated sigh, drumming his fingers against the armrest, as if the mere presence of Eloise Garner beside him was an unbearable inconvenience. He glanced toward the flight attendant again, shaking his head in mock disbelief. "Honestly, how does this even happen? Shouldn't there be some sort of, I don't know, size regulation? I mean, I get it, equality and all that nonsense, but let's be real. First-class seats aren't designed to accommodate this." He gestured vaguely in Eloise's direction, his eyes flicking over her body with barely concealed contempt. The flight attendant's expression tightened, but before she could respond, Eloise tugged at her seatbelt one more time, trying to fasten it, her fingers fumbling as the strap refused to stretch far enough. Caldwell let out a sharp chuckle, turning toward the nearest passenger, a man flipping through a newspaper, and smirked. "Would you look at that? We might need to call in ground crew for reinforcement." The man barely looked up, shifting uncomfortably, unwilling to engage, but a few seats away, someone let out a low chuckle. Eloise exhaled through her nose, blinking rapidly to fight back the sting in her eyes. She had spent a lifetime navigating moments like these, enduring the sneers, the whispered comments, the judgmental glances. But something about Caldwell Draper's voice, so loud, so unapologetically cruel, made this feel worse. With her heart pounding, she forced herself to speak, keeping her voice steady. "I'll manage." Caldwell feigned surprise, placing a hand over his chest. "Oh, she speaks. And here I thought you'd just sit there, taking up space in silence." He tilted his head, watching as she struggled, then turned to the flight attendant once more. "Listen, do you have an extension belt or something? Or should we just give up now and admit the engineering department never planned for this level of stress testing?" The flight attendant, a woman in her mid-30s with a professional yet strained smile, nodded quickly, stepping away to retrieve the seatbelt extension. Caldwell sighed dramatically, rubbing his temples, as if he were being subjected to some grave injustice. "You know, I booked this flight expecting a comfortable experience. Instead, I'm stuck here watching a live demonstration of why personal responsibility matters." He looked directly at Eloise now, his smirk widening. "Tell me something, at what point did you decide to just give up?" Eloise's grip tightened around the useless seatbelt strap, her nails pressing into her palm. "Excuse me." Caldwell leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice but ensuring it was still loud enough for those nearby to hear. "You heard me. It takes effort to reach that size." effort to ignore every warning sign, every mirror, every moment where you could have made a different choice. But you didn't, did you? And now here we are. His tone was casual, almost conversational, as if he were discussing stock market trends rather than systematically humiliating another human being. Eloise felt her throat tighten, but before she could form a response, the flight attendant returned with the extension belt, her hand slightly unsteady as she handed it to her. "Here you go, ma'am." Caldwell snorted. "Oh good, a solution. Now we just need to get Boeing to reinforce the seat frames, and we'll be all set." The flight attendant stiffened, but said nothing. Eloise took the extension without a word, fumbling as she clipped it in place. Her breath was uneven, her hands trembling slightly. Caldwell watched her struggle, his amusement undiminished. He leaned back in his seat, shaking his head as he muttered, "It's like watching a slow-motion disaster." A few rows ahead, an elderly woman shot him a disapproving glance, but Caldwell simply met her gaze with an unbothered smirk. He lived for moments like these, where he could assert dominance without consequence. The problem with the world, in his mind, was that people had become too soft, too afraid to acknowledge reality. And reality, as he saw it, was simple. People like Eloise Garner didn't belong in spaces like this. First class was meant for the elite, for those who had earned it, and she was an eyesore, a reminder of everything he found repulsive. Eloise, meanwhile, focused on her breathing, on the rise and fall of her chest as she tried to steady herself. She refused to cry. Not here, not in front of him. But the weight of his words pressed down on her, heavier than the seat belt cutting into her stomach. She had spent her entire life proving she belonged in places people like Caldwell thought she didn't. She had built a career, raised a family, overcome obstacles that would have broken lesser people. Yet here she was, reduced to nothing more than the subject of a cruel joke. The flight attendant cleared her throat, attempting to redirect the conversation. "Sir, may I get you something to drink?" Caldwell waved her off. "I'm fine, but maybe she could use a protein shake. Start turning things around." The attendant hesitated, as if considering saying something, but then thought better of it and simply walked away. Caldwell smirked, turning back to Eloise. "You should really thank me," he said, stretching his legs out comfortably. "I mean, how often does someone tell you the truth to your face? Most people just smile politely and pretend like they don't notice." He glanced around the cabin, his smirk widening as he reached down, grabbed his leather carry-on, and without warning, plopped it onto Eloise's lap. The bag was heavy, filled with files and electronic devices, but he pressed it down further, watching her reaction with amusement. "Mind holding this for me?" he asked, though it was clear he had no intention of giving her a choice. Eloise stiffened, her fingers curling against the seat as the weight pressed into her stomach. Caldwell leaned back with exaggerated ease. "I figure you've got plenty of room to spare. Might as well put it to use." Eloise's breath came in short, controlled bursts as she reached for the bag, her arms straining as she lifted it slightly, attempting to move it off her lap. Caldwell barely gave her a second before pressing down harder, forcing it back against her thighs. "Careful now," he taunted. "Wouldn't want you to overexert yourself." The words slithered out, laced with condescension, his eyes glinting with the kind of cruelty that only came from a man who enjoyed watching people squirm. The cabin had fallen into an uncomfortable silence, passengers too afraid or too indifferent to step in. The flight attendant from earlier lingered near the front, her expression tight as if debating whether to intervene, but she remained rooted in place, unwilling to challenge Caldwell's authority. Eloise clenched her jaw and shoved the bag aside with a force that surprised even herself. It tumbled to the floor, landing with a dull thud. Caldwell raised an eyebrow, feigning offense as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Feisty," he murmured. "Didn't think you had it in you." His voice lowered barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to cut. "But let's be real. We both know you don't belong here." His fingers drummed against the armrest, the leather creaking slightly beneath his grip. "You see, first class isn't just about money. It's about presentation, elegance. And no matter how much you paid for that seat, you can't buy your way into looking like you belong." Eloise's throat tightened, her pulse hammering beneath her skin. She had fought too many battles in her life to let this man reduce her to nothing. Yet here she was, feeling every ounce of his words seep into her bones like poison. She forced herself to inhale, to exhale, to not let him see the way he was getting to her. But Caldwell could sense it. He could smell weakness, like a predator scenting blood in the water. He leaned back again, a slow smirk stretching across his face as he turned to the man sitting across the aisle, a middle-aged executive who had been pretending to read his newspaper for the past 10 minutes. "Tell me," Caldwell said, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear, "how much do you think she weighs?" The man stiffened, his eyes darting to Eloise before quickly returning to his paper. Caldwell chuckled, undeterred by the lack of response. "No guesses? Come on, I say 300, maybe 350 if we're being generous." He tapped his chin thoughtfully. "Actually, maybe the airline should start charging passengers by the pound. Seems fair, doesn't it?" A couple of hushed chuckles rippled through the cabin, not loud enough to be outright support, but enough to let Eloise know that no one would be coming to her defense. She swallowed hard, her hands gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles turned white. Caldwell wasn't finished. He stretched his arms behind his head, his voice carrying a lazy amusement. "I mean, imagine the fuel costs alone. It's basic physics. More weight, more fuel, higher prices for the rest of us. You're costing us money, sweetheart." He turned to the flight attendant, who was now rigidly pretending to check the beverage cart. "Tell me, what's the weight limit for these seats? Or are we just letting anyone waddle in these days?" The attendant hesitated, her eyes flickering toward Eloise, then Caldwell, then back again. Her lips parted as if she were about to say something, but then she simply pressed them together and continued her work. Caldwell laughed under his breath, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "No answer? Shame. Guess we'll just have to wait and see if the seat holds." Eloise felt something inside her crack, not just humiliation, not just anger, but a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. The kind that settled into the marrow, the kind that came from a lifetime of moments just like this one, a lifetime of being scrutinized, judged, dismissed. She forced herself to stare straight ahead, to pretend she didn't hear him, but her vision blurred, the burn behind her eyes impossible to ignore. Caldwell watched her carefully, his smirk never fading. "Ah," he said softly, almost gleefully. "There it is." He tilted his head, examining her like a scientist observing an experiment. That moment when it really sinks in, when you realize no matter how much you pretend, no matter how much you try to blend in, you'll always stand out. You'll always be too much. His voice dipped lower, meant only for her. "And you hate it, don't you?" Eloise blinked rapidly, but the single tear that slipped down her cheek betrayed her. Caldwell's smile widened. "There it is," he murmured. "Admit it. You don't belong here." His words were a whisper, but they echoed like a scream. Caldwell Draper let out a theatrical sigh, rolling his eyes as Eloise Garner struggled in her seat, her large frame pressed tightly between the armrests. He stretched his arms out dramatically, making a show of checking his watch as if waiting for her to complete a task as simple as shifting over. When she didn't move fast enough, he clicked his tongue in mock impatience and leaned toward her, his voice dripping with condescension. "Come on now, don't keep us all waiting. You're blocking the aisle. Surely you can squeeze yourself in a little more." He made a slight shooing motion with his hand as if urging a child, or more accurately an animal, to move out of his way. Eloise inhaled sharply, her hands gripping the sides of her seat as she tried to adjust her position. The armrests dug painfully into her sides, and the more she shifted, the more difficult it became. Her breathing grew uneven, not from exertion, but from the sheer humiliation of struggling to do something so simple in front of an audience. She pushed against the armrest, attempting to angle her body just enough for Caldwell to pass, but the tight confines of the seat made it nearly impossible. She felt trapped, suffocated, every movement amplifying the shame that already burned in her chest. Caldwell smirked, shaking his head as he crossed his arms. "Unbelievable. First class isn't supposed to feel like economy, but here we are." He turned to a man sitting nearby, an older gentleman who had been pretending not to listen, and let out a dramatic whisper. I mean, if I wanted this kind of legroom, I would have flown, coach. The man gave a forced chuckle, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to challenge him. Caldwell's gaze snapped back to Eloise, who was still struggling, her face flushed with effort and embarrassment. His patience, or rather his amusement, began to wane. Without warning, Caldwell reached out and pushed her shoulder. It wasn't a hard shove, but it was firm enough to send a clear message. Move. Now. Eloise gasped, startled by the sudden contact, and for a brief moment, time seemed to slow as her balance wavered. Her foot caught on the edge of her bag beneath the seat, and before she could steady herself, her body tipped forward. She tried to grab onto the armrest, but it was too late. With a thud that seemed to echo through the cabin, Eloise fell face first into the aisle. A sharp gasp rippled through the nearby passengers as she hit the floor, her hand splaying out to break the fall, her glasses slipping down her nose. Pain shot up her knee, where it had collided with the metal track of the seat, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the horrifying silence that followed. The flight attendants froze, their expressions a mixture of shock and hesitation. The other passengers averted their eyes, pretending they hadn't just witnessed what had happened. And then Caldwell laughed. It wasn't just a chuckle or a quiet snicker. It was a full-bodied, unapologetic laugh. He sat back, one hand resting against his stomach, as if he had just heard the funniest joke in the world. "Oh wow," he managed between laughs, shaking his head. "I didn't actually think that would happen. Guess physics really doesn't play favorites, huh?" Eloise pressed her palms against the cold floor, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her vision blurred, not from the pain, but from the overwhelming humiliation. She could feel the stares boring into her, feel the weight of a dozen silent judgments pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. She needed to get up, but her limbs felt heavy, paralyzed by the sheer indignity of being sprawled out on the floor like she was some kind of spectacle. The flight attendant closest to her finally snapped out of her daze and rushed forward, bending down to offer assistance. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Her voice was gentle, but the pity in her eyes made Eloise's stomach churn. Caldwell exhaled through his nose, shaking his head in amusement as he nudged Eloise's foot with his shoe. "Come on now," he said lazily, as if he were coaxing a dog to stand. "Take your time, but don't hold up the flight. I mean, I'd offer to help you up, but let's be honest, I'm not exactly in the market for a dislocated shoulder." The flight attendant shot him a horrified glare, but he remained unfazed. Eloise squeezed her eyes shut for a brief second, fighting back the tears that burned at the edges. Every part of her screamed to fight back, to say something, anything to reclaim her dignity, but the words refused to come. She had been humiliated before countless times, but this was something else entirely. This was public degradation. Her fingers curled into fists against the floor as she willed herself to rise. With great effort, she shifted her weight onto her knees, grasping the seat for support as she slowly pulled herself upright. Her entire body trembled, whether from exertion or emotion, she couldn't tell. The flight attendant tried to steady her, whispering words of reassurance, but they barely registered in Eloise's ears. Caldwell sighed, clearly bored now. "All right, now that that's over, can we move on? I really don't want to spend this whole flight watching the next episode of my 600 pounds life live." Eloise Garner forced herself upright, her knees trembling as she steadied herself against the armrest. Her breathing came in sharp, uneven bursts, her chest rising and falling too quickly, but she refused to let herself crumble any further. She could still hear the echoes of Caldwell Draper's laughter, the way it filled the cabin like a cruel soundtrack to her degradation, and she wished, just for a moment, that the plane would lurch forward and send him sprawling the same way she had fallen. But fate, as always, seemed to favor men like him. He stood there effortlessly, still smirking, still winning. Caldwell tilted his head, examining her as if she were some bizarre creature struggling to perform a trick. "Well, that was dramatic," he said, crossing his arms over his chest. "I mean, I know turbulence can be rough, but that was next level. Maybe the airline should start installing railings for cases like yours." He let out a short, amused breath, clearly entertained by his own joke, and then, with mock concern, He took a step back and raised his hands in feigned alarm. "Whoa, now are you sure you should be standing? Wouldn't want you to take out a row of seats if you go down again." A fresh wave of chuckles rippled through the cabin, not loud, not overt, but present enough to make Eloise's stomach twist. She gripped the seat tighter, her nails pressing into the fabric, her vision blurring as she tried to focus on anything except the heat crawling up her throat. The tears that had been threatening to spill finally breached the edges of her eyes, and despite her best efforts, despite every ounce of willpower she summoned to keep them at bay, they escaped. Caldwell's smirk widened. That was what he had been waiting for. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice but ensuring it still carried to those closest to them. "Oh, don't cry," he murmured, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "It's not a good look. Makes you seem weak. And let's be honest, you're already struggling enough in the aesthetics department." He gestured vaguely in her direction, his eyes flicking over her body like she was something offensive to look at. "I mean, tears are one thing, but if you start sobbing, you might get dehydrated, and I'm not sure this flight is stocked with enough water bottles to compensate." Eloise squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, willing the tears to stop, but her body had already betrayed her. She hated this, hated that she was reacting, hated that she had let him push her this far, hated that she had spent a lifetime building herself into someone strong only to fall apart at the hands of a man who wasn't worth the air he breathed. Caldwell Draper wasn't done. He turned to the flight attendant standing nearby, the same one who had hesitated earlier, the one who had done nothing as this all unfolded. "Tell me," he said, flashing a grin, "do we charge extra for water if it's consumed out of pure emotional instability? Or is that covered in the first-class amenities?" The flight attendant's face paled, her fingers tightening around the tablet in her hands. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but Caldwell was already moving past her, focusing on Eloise again. "Here's the thing," he continued, his voice lowering into something almost conspiratorial, like he was letting her in on some great secret. This is why people like me run the world, and people like you just take up space in it. We don't break, we don't crumble, and we sure as hell don't cry in public because someone said something mean." He tapped his temple lightly. "It's all up here. Strength. That's why I get to sit here comfortably while you struggle to even fit." Eloise sucked in a sharp breath, her shoulders shaking now, her hands clenched so tightly against the seat that her knuckles turned white. She felt like she was imploding, like every single cruel word that had ever been thrown her way had fused together into the singular, crushing force of this moment. Caldwell exhaled slowly, feigning disappointment. "Honestly, I expected more fight out of you. Usually, the ones who try so hard to act like they belong have a little more backbone. But here you are, proving me right. You can dress the part, buy the ticket, sit in the seat, but at the end of the day..." He shook his head, smirking. "You're still exactly who we all knew you were." Eloise felt something inside her crack, not just emotionally, but physically. Her legs buckled, and she collapsed back into her seat, her body shaking uncontrollably as the silent sobs racked through her chest. Caldwell leaned back, satisfied. Eloise Garner tried to compose herself. The sight of her trembling shoulders, her tear-streaked face, the way she hunched into herself like she could somehow shrink away from the moment, only fueled his amusement. He lived for this. Power wasn't just about money or status. It was about control, about bending people until they snapped, about watching them crumble, and knowing he was the one who made it happen. He reached for the glass of sparkling water on his tray, swirled it lazily in his hand, and then, without hesitation, tilted it forward. A small stream of cold water splashed onto Eloise's seat. She flinched as the moisture soaked into the fabric beneath her, a sharp inhale catching in her throat. Caldwell smirked, setting the glass back down as he leaned toward the nearest flight attendant. "I really can't do this anymore," he said, shaking his head in exaggerated frustration. "I was hoping this would be tolerable, but I can literally feel the seat shifting every time she moves. It's like turbulence without the actual plane moving." He sighed, looking back at Eloise, who was now staring at the wet spot on her seat, her body frozen. The flight attendant hesitated, her eyes flickering between Caldwell and Eloise, her hands tightening around the tablet she held. Caldwell arched an eyebrow, daring her to challenge him, but before she could respond, a more senior crew member approached. The head flight attendant, a composed woman in her 40s with a polished uniform and the kind of weary authority that came from years of dealing with difficult passengers, stopped beside them. Her expression was neutral, but her posture was tense. "Sir," she began, her voice careful, "we ask that all passengers remain respectful toward each other." Caldwell laughed. It was short, sharp, mocking. "Oh, I am being respectful. I'm just pointing out an obvious problem that, frankly, you should have addressed before this flight even took off." He gestured vaguely at Eloise, who still hadn't spoken, still hadn't moved. "I'm just saying what everyone is thinking, but is too scared to say out loud." The head flight attendant pressed her lips together in a tight line before turning to Eloise, her voice noticeably softer. "Mrs. Garner, if you'd like, we can find a more comfortable seat for you." Eloise blinked. The words felt like a slap. She had spent her entire life earning her place in rooms where people thought she didn't belong. She had built a career, raised a family, survived a world that constantly tried to push her out, and yet, here she was being offered an exit like she was some inconvenience that needed to be removed. She shook her head slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I paid for this seat." Caldwell groaned, running a hand through his hair as if the situation was exhausting him. "Come on," he drawled. "Let's not be difficult. We all know this isn't working." He turned back to the flight attendant, flashing that same infuriating smirk. "If she won't move, then maybe I should. I mean, assuming you have a seat available for someone who actually fits." The head flight attendant's jaw tightened, but before she could respond, Eloise suddenly moved. She reached down, grasping the wet spot on her seat with shaking fingers, and then, in a slow, deliberate motion, she wiped her palm against her pants. She forced herself to breathe, forced herself to absorb the humiliation that had been piled onto her from the moment this flight began, forced herself to keep control when every part of her wanted to shatter. Caldwell leaned in slightly, watching her with a twisted sort of fascination. "That's the thing about people like you," he murmured, his voice low, private, meant only for her. "You always think you can handle it. You always think you belong. But no matter how much you try, you always break." Eloise's fingers curled into fists. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, her weight moving from foot to foot as she cast a glance around the cabin. Passengers were watching, some with poorly hidden amusement, others with a kind of silent discomfort that came from witnessing something cruel, but lacking the courage to intervene. Eloise bit the inside of her cheek, hard enough that she tasted blood, hard enough to force herself not to cry again. And then, for the first time since this flight began, something inside her changed. It was small at first, a shift so subtle that even she didn't fully recognize it, but it spread, a realization, a slow, creeping understanding that this wasn't going to stop. Caldwell Draper was never going to stop. The flight attendants were never going to intervene. The passengers were never going to speak up. Caldwell Draper watched with growing irritation as Eloise Garner sat up straighter, her tears gone, her expression no longer filled with the pathetic defeat he had been savoring for the past hour. He had broken her. He had watched her crumble, shake, cry. And yet, somehow, she was still sitting there, breathing through it, holding herself together, refusing to sink further. That didn't sit well with him. She wasn't supposed to recover. She wasn't supposed to be anything but wrecked. He narrowed his eyes, tilting his head slightly as he considered his next move. Eloise reached for a napkin from the tray table, wiped at her face with steady hands, and placed it neatly in front of her. Caldwell clenched his jaw. No, this wasn't over. He had seen so many people like her before, people who thought they could force themselves into spaces where they didn't belong, people who believed that their mere persistence was enough to grant them a seat at a table they were never meant to be at. He wouldn't let her walk away from this unscarred. His smirk returned, sharper this time, edged with something crueler, more deliberate. Without hesitation, without warning, without an ounce of shame, he reached forward and placed both hands on her stomach. The gasp that echoed through the first-class cabin was instantaneous, a collective sharp intake of breath from the surrounding passengers. But Caldwell wasn't paying attention to them. his fingers pressed lightly against her belly, just enough to make the movement deliberate, just enough for her to feel every inch of his touch. And then, with a casual, mocking shake, he grinned. "Wow," he murmured, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I wasn't sure if it was fat or just extra luggage, but it moves." Eloise froze, completely paralyzed, her entire body going rigid under his hands, her mind blanking out in sheer, unimaginable horror. A deep, painful silence engulfed the cabin, suffocating, unbearable, stretching across every row as if time itself had stopped. A snicker from somewhere to her left. A muffled chuckle from the businessman 2 rows ahead. A woman biting her lip to keep from smiling, failing miserably. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to let her know that somewhere, in this very moment, there were people who found this amusing. Her breath hitched violently. Her chest tightened. Her vision blurred at the edges. And before she could stop herself, before she could hold it in, before she could remind herself that she was stronger than this, she let out a soft, broken sob. Caldwell's smirk widened. That was what he had been waiting for. Eloise clapped a hand over her mouth, her shoulders shaking, her entire body betraying her. Her heart was pounding too fast, too loud, her lungs struggling to pull in enough air, her entire being caving in on itself, as the weight of humiliation crushed her down deeper than ever before. Caldwell let out a slow chuckle, finally removing his hands as he leaned back in his seat, fully satisfied. "Relax," he drawled, his voice thick with fake amusement. "I was just curious. I mean, let's be honest, at this point, we're all wondering the same thing." The businessman from earlier stifled another chuckle. The woman next to him nudged her friend. A few passengers shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable, but none of them spoke. Eloise couldn't breathe. Her hands trembled violently as she pressed them against her lap, her fingers digging into her thighs so hard it hurt. Her entire body flooded with shame so deep it made her dizzy. The heat crawled up her throat, burning, choking, her tears falling too freely now, her walls completely shattered. Caldwell exhaled dramatically, shaking his head like he was bored now, done, finished. "All right, well, that was fun, but I think I've had my entertainment for the evening. Flight attendant." He snapped his fingers at the young blonde crew member, who flinched at the sound. "If you wouldn't mind, I'd love to get some champagne. Preferably a bottle that hasn't been compromised by the extra humidity levels over here." The flight attendant hesitated for 1 second too long. Caldwell raised an eyebrow, daring her to defy him. She swallowed thickly and nodded, turning toward the galley without a word. Eloise stared down at her lap, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to exist. The finality of it all sank in, the undeniable truth that she had lost. There was no coming back from this, no salvaging her dignity, no undoing what had just happened. Caldwell had taken everything from her in this moment, stripped her down to nothing but humiliation, and there was nothing she could do. Caldwell reached for his phone, tapping at the screen as if he had already forgotten about her. "Honestly," he muttered, not even looking up, "I don't know why people get so emotional about the truth. If you don't want people to notice, maybe don't make it so obvious." Eloise let out a choked sound, something between a gasp and a sob, her entire body recoiling inward, her hands gripping the seat as if it were the only thing keeping her from collapsing completely. Caldwell glanced down, expecting another routine notification, but instead, an unfamiliar name flashed across the screen. Mason Garner. The surname struck a faint chord, but his mind, still basking in the glow of his supposed victory, dismissed the relevance. Annoyance flickered across his face as he let the phone ring a few times before answering, with his usual effortless confidence. "Draper speaking," he said, already sounding bored, already assuming this was someone insignificant. The voice that responded, however, was anything but insignificant. "I'm Mason Garner," the man said, his tone clipped, controlled, carrying the kind of restrained fury that sent a pulse of unease through Caldwell's chest. "And I'm watching you." Caldwell blinked, the words not quite sinking in, his free hand adjusting the cuff of his sleeve as if that could ground him in the moment. His gaze flickered toward Eloise, who was now staring at him with something different in her eyes, something unsettling, something that made his stomach tighten just slightly. Mason's voice cut through his thoughts like a blade. "You just humiliated my mother. You put your hands on her. You mocked her, degraded her, treated her like she was beneath you. And you did it on a plane owned by my family." Caldwell's breath stalled. A slow, creeping cold spread through his limbs, a sensation he hadn't felt in years, a feeling so foreign that for a split second, his mind refused to process it. "That's a lie," he snapped, his voice sharper than he intended, his confidence faltering in a way that felt dangerously close to panic. But Mason didn't react the way most people did when challenged by Caldwell Draper. There was no hesitation, no scrambling to justify, no shrinking under pressure. Just a quiet, almost bored certainty as he delivered the next sentence. "Check your stock reports." Caldwell's stomach twisted. His thumb moved before his brain fully caught up, swiping over to his market tracking app, his heartbeat pounding in his ears as the screen refreshed. His mind barely registered the exact numbers, only that they were plummeting, his entire financial empire unraveling in real time. His jaw clenched so hard it ached, his body rigid, his breath coming shorter, shallower, because this wasn't just a dip, this was a catastrophic collapse. Mason's voice returned, calm, almost mocking. "I already pulled every deal we had with Draper Industries. Every investment, every partnership, every contract. This is what happens when you mess with the wrong family." Caldwell's grip on his phone tightened, his knuckles white as panic curled inside his chest like a tightening vice. His world was shifting too fast, slipping through his fingers like sand, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he had no control. His voice came out strained, forced through clenched teeth. "You can't do this." Mason's laughter was low, devoid of humor. "I already did. And we're not done." The line went dead. Caldwell sat frozen, phone still pressed to his ear, mind racing through solutions, damage control, anything that could salvage this. But the weight in his gut told him there was nothing. Then the intercom crackled again, and the captain's voice returned, smooth and professional, but carrying an unmistakable finality. "Mr. Draper, upon landing, you will be escorted off this aircraft. Effective immediately, you are permanently banned from flying with our airline. Furthermore, per executive directive, all existing partnerships between Draper Industries and our company are officially terminated." The air in the cabin thickened. A hush fell over the passengers, their expressions shifting from curiosity to outright disbelief, some whispering, others simply watching as Caldwell Draper, a man who had spent his entire life bending the world to his will, sat utterly powerless. His face had lost all color, his jaw locked so tightly that his teeth ached, his fingers clenched into fists against his thighs as the full weight of what had just happened settled over him like an avalanche. His name, his reputation, his empire, gone, collapsing in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Caldwell Draper's fingers gripped the armrest so tightly that his knuckles turned white as the full realization of his downfall crashed into him like a wrecking ball. His empire wasn't crumbling, it was disintegrating before his very eyes, piece by piece, dollar by dollar, power by power, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His breath was shallow, his heart hammering violently against his ribs as whispers rippled through the first-class cabin, growing louder with every second that passed. Passengers who had once laughed along with him, who had smirked at his cruelty, were now watching him like prey, their expressions shifting from amusement to something far more dangerous: anticipation. The world had turned, and they could smell blood in the water. Then a sharp voice cut through the murmurs, commanding, unwavering, drenched in finality. "Mr. Draper," the head flight attendant said, standing rigid, her posture exuding the kind of professional authority that left no room for negotiation. "You are to disembark immediately upon landing. Security will escort you." Caldwell turned sharply toward her, his mind reeling, his jaw tightening as his pulse pounded in his ears. "This is ridiculous," he hissed, his voice lower now, almost dangerous, almost desperate. "Do you know who I am?" The flight attendant didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge the words he had used as a weapon all his life. "Yes," she said coolly, her face unreadable. "That's why you're being removed." Caldwell's stomach twisted. He had spent years, decades even, forcing people to bend, to yield, to step aside whenever he so much as exhaled in their direction. But now, right now, the power was gone. The very thing that had defined him had been stripped from his hands so abruptly, so violently, that for the first time in his life, he was experiencing something he had never truly known: helplessness. He could feel the passengers' eyes on him, their attention no longer rooted in fear or admiration, but in something worse: satisfaction. They were enjoying this. A few seats away, a phone screen flickered. Then, another. A businessman in a dark suit subtly angled his device, recording from the corner of his seat, his lips pressed together to stifle a smirk. A woman across the aisle, the same one who had laughed at Eloise earlier, now held up her phone with zero shame, her expression unreadable, but her camera locked onto Caldwell's face. Caldwell's skin prickled, his mind racing as realization slammed into him harder than even the stock crash. They were filming. This moment, this humiliation, this undoing of everything he had built was being documented, captured, broadcasted, before he even had the chance to breathe through it. Eloise Garner hadn't moved. She sat with quiet stillness, her hands resting in her lap, her breathing even, her gaze steady. Caldwell felt something ugly twist in his chest, something that burned more than the loss of his company, more than the money evaporating by the second, more than the security team that had just entered the first-class cabin. She had won. She hadn't needed to lift a finger, hadn't needed to retaliate, hadn't needed to do anything at all, because the world had taken care of it for her. The humiliation he had tried to crush her with had rebounded with such violent force that it had obliterated him instead. "Sir," one of the uniformed security officers said, stepping closer, his stance firm, his voice clipped with finality. "You need to come with us." Caldwell jerked his head up, his breath uneven, his mind still scrambling for a way out, a loophole, an escape, a lifeline. But there was none. He was out of moves. He was done. Slowly, stiffly, as if the weight of the moment had physically pressed him into a seat, he rose. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, the phone still recording, the eyes still watching, and the slow drip of satisfaction from every single witness was suffocating. Caldwell squared his shoulders, forcing every remaining ounce of dignity into his posture, but the illusion was shattered. His tie was askew, his forehead damp with sweat, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides. He could feel the world caving in, pressing in on him from all directions, and the suffocating, overwhelming certainty that he would never recover from this settled deep into his chest like an iron weight. Caldwell Draper stepped off the plane under the crushing weight of the security officers flanking him, his step slow, his body tense, his breath tight in his chest as he walked through the terminal like a man heading toward his own execution. He could hear the murmurs, the whispers, the sound of cameras clicking as airport staff, travelers, and journalists who had already caught wind of his downfall turned their heads to watch. The air felt too thick, too suffocating, and with every step his mind raced, scrambled, clawed for a way to undo what had already been set in motion. He had spent years cultivating power, bending industries to his will, making people cower at the mere mention of his name, and now, in a matter of hours, he had become a spectacle, a living cautionary tale, a man whose empire had crumbled before the plane had even landed. The first blow came within minutes of stepping onto the jet bridge, his phone vibrating violently in his pocket as his assistant's frantic voice spilled through the speaker before he even had the chance to greet her. "They pulled everything," she choked out, her usual composed demeanor shattered by panic. "The board just held an emergency vote. You're out, Caldwell. You've been removed. Your shares are tanking, investors are bailing, the company's bleeding out." Caldwell stopped walking, his body locking up as the words hit him like a freight train. Removed. The word felt foreign, impossible, a mistake, because he was Caldwell Draper. He didn't get removed. He didn't get replaced. He did the replacing. The second blow came before he even had time to process the first, another call flashing across his screen, this time from his legal team. His attorney's voice was cold, devoid of the usual forced reverence he had grown accustomed to. "We need to talk. There's an SEC investigation being opened into your finances, and with the contracts Mason Garner just severed, we're looking at a level of exposure that..." Caldwell didn't hear the rest. his vision blurred at the edges, his heartbeat a violent, erratic thrum against his ribs as the reality solidified into something irreversible. The third blow came hours later, when news outlets plastered his face across every screen, every headline dripping with the glee of poetic justice, every financial expert analyzing, every social commentator tearing into the man who had built his life on cruelty, only to be dismantled by his own arrogance. Investors had cut ties, stocks had plummeted beyond saving, lawsuits were already piling up, and social media had done what it did best. It had turned him into the most hated man in the country. Video after video surfaced, clips of his humiliation on the flight dissected, memed, replayed millions of times. People who had once feared him now mocking him openly, reveling in his downfall with a hunger that felt personal. Caldwell Draper, the man who had ruled boardrooms, dictated markets, and crushed anyone in his way, had become a punchline. The final blow came 3 days later, when his accounts were frozen, his assets seized, and his name, once the hallmark of power and untouchable success, was now nothing more than a stain on the industry he had once dominated. His phone, which had once never stopped ringing with opportunities, deals, and invitations, had fallen completely silent. His penthouse, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city he had once controlled, now felt small, suffocating, empty. He sat in the darkness, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up, staring at the last remnants of his empire slipping through his fingers. No one called to help. No one called to offer him a way back. No one called at all. And somewhere miles away, in a home filled with warmth, Eloise Garner sat at her kitchen table, sipping her tea, breathing easily, peacefully, freely. She had no need for revenge, no need for retaliation, no need to lift a single finger. The world had taken care of it for her. Caldwell Draper had undone himself. The end. If you enjoyed watching Caldwell Draper's downfall, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories of justice served. What was your favorite moment in this epic revenge? Did you expect the twist, or did it completely shock you? Let us know in the comments below. And before you go, tell us, where are you watching from today? We love seeing viewers from all over the world.